Why high stats aren't everything. The Quagsire Theorem. Let's see what we can apply to not only Pokemon, but other games as well.
Competitive Pokemon is by and large dominated by the types of Pokemon you'd expect, those with multiple excellent useful stats. This is
Fluttermane is genuinely my new favorite Pokemon. It is just perfect in every conceivable way to me.
most easily exemplified by legendaries, mythicals, and pseudo-legendaries, but there are plenty of so-called quote-unquote regular Pokemon that fit the bill just as well. For example, Pokemon like Ferrothorn, Excadrill, or Slowbro aren't legendary, mythical, or pseudo-legendary, but they've been among the best, most consistent Pokemon for multiple generations.
Yes.
Pokemon that succeed in the competitive scene generally have one or two really high stats, but also have a balanced set of stats across the board. Even something like Kyurem Black and its hilariously high 170 base attack are supported by solid bulk, speed, and special attack. But there are some Pokemon who succeed despite not having any of that.
Right.
But before we get to that, customize your browser like you customize your teams, because this video is sponsored by Opera GX.
That's cool.
And I'm so glad to be sponsored by them because I switched to Opera from Chrome like 2 years ago, and it was one of the best decisions I've ever made. And here's the reason I switched. Chrome uses a lot of RAM, and
Yeah, it
Opera
does.
GX is known for its GX control feature, which limits the use of your CPU or RAM of your browser. Look at how much Opera uses versus other browsers. That way you can have a bunch of tabs open and not worry about it lagging your games. And trust me, I keep a lot of tabs open when looking up stuff to make videos. Opera GX aims to make browsers way less boring, and they accomplish this by having a lot of mods. For example, you want to make it feel like an old Game Boy? Just install the GX Boy theme.
Really?
It comes with sound effects.
Really? I actually didn't know this. Huh.
You can make it look cozy by choosing the cozy theme, or make it look futuristic with Cyber Deck. There's even community themes like the Gengar one, making your browser spooky like our boy.
I love it.
But I get it. It's a hassle to have to transfer over all of your data from your old browser. Except when it's not. Use Opera GX's quick import tool and import all your browser history, bookmarks, cookies, you name it, in less than a minute. Also, Opera GX is compatible with every Chrome extension. So get a browser that is
neat.
literally better at everything by using my link in the description below and download Opera GX for free.
I might try it out, actually. I've heard a lot of good things about it.
So what then is the Quagsire Theorem? Well, it's rarer, but sometimes there are Pokemon that are fixtures in the competitive scene despite not being very impressive statistically. In fact, they're so unimpressive, the fact that they succeeded can often baffle players. How are they struggling with a Pokemon with a base stat spread more in line with lower tiers, where such Pokemon often reside even temporarily, despite their OU viability? This is one of the things that makes competitive Pokemon so interesting. Though it's not just about the stats, while they are of course important, it's about a confluence of factors from typing to ability to move pool, and sometimes these come together with such impact that overcome the stats and launch their Pokemon to star status. Why is it named after Quagsire? 1, because Quagsire is a perfect example of this concept. 2, because Quagsire rules, which is all the reason
Based Quagsire.
anyone should need, and then some. And there's a third reason, which you'll see later. Today, we're exploring Pokemon with unimpressive stat spreads using a general guideline of not having any base stats of or higher than base 100, that regardless manage to find heavy competitive success in the higher tiers. We call this the Quagsire Theorem.
I mean, it tracks. From my history in Pokemon, I mean, you can have a Pokemon that has every single stat, none of them exceeds 100. As long as it's balanced properly, that's completely fine. Let's look at Fluttermane, like in the beginning of the video, right? It's got 135 in special attack, special defense, and speed, right? But HP, attack, and defense are 35s or something like that. It's really, really low. Like if you get sneezed on by a physical attack, you're hurting. That's obviously a more extreme end of the spectrum because all the Ultra Beasts all the Paradox Pokemon have their own things they have their own niches, and the stat blocks are like that for a reason by design. You could have Fluttermane, for example. We have Fluttermane, physically, if something hits it, it's gonna die. But if anything special, it's kind of like Chansey in that regard. It's gonna be a bit tankier. It's gonna do a little bit better of a job on that. And therefore it does have a niche, and because of its power in regard and speed in regard to that as well, a multitude of factors as well as plus the I almost said Beast Boost again. with the stupid ability, right? Is it photosynthesis? I think. You know, you have a solid Pokemon there because you're immediately going +1 if you set up correctly to whatever your highest stat is, which is awesome. Versus something like trying to find something from Gen 9, but it's escaping me. Versus something like, I don't know, Superior, right? Let's just say Superior. Like, Superior has its own niche and has its coil sets and stuff like that. But if you take a Superior and you take a look at Incineroar, due to a multitude of factors, you know, Incineroar is arguably meta-defining. If Incineroar is in a format, Incineroar will be played, and Incineroar is actually a problem for that reason. I know we talked about Flutter Mane, this is a bit better of an example. You know, it's because there's a multitude of factors coming into it. It's not just the stat, it's a starter. Starters generally have, like, an good stat or two, and then, you know, kind of goes from there. But Incineroar Landorus are issues, especially in doubles VGC. Keys!
When it comes to the Pokemon it's surrounded by in the higher tiers, Klefki's stats aren't just lower, they're outright bad. It's
so the thing that sells Klefki for me, while it has a HP of 57, you can also supplement that. It has good defensive typing in Steel Fairy, one of the best typings in the game in my opinion, especially offensively. It does have, you can use a Focus Band, or Focus Sash, I guess Focus Band if you want to try to gamble, right? And someone else is using your Focus Sash. You know, you can supplement it with that. You could throw EVs into HP, try to make it a little bulkier because these defensive stats aren't necessarily horrible. You are looking at doing more status because it does have Prankster as well. Prankster is one of my most loved abilities in the game. It is arguably incredibly powerful, hence why the nerfs it's gotten in recent generations. Like, Klefki's stats work in a specific way in tandem with Prankster and its typing, as well as its move pool, Toxic, Magnet Rise, Heal Block, right, T-Wave, Spikes, that it can fulfill a role very well. It's not just its stats, which are, as he's saying, arguably bad. It's that the typing and the ability and the move set also come into play here.
Defensive Pokemon with an aggressively underwhelming base 57 HP. Well, fine, the Rotom appliances have even lower HP than that, and they're excellent, but Klefki doesn't have the defensive stats they do. Its base 87 special defense, while decent in its own right, isn't enough to compensate for that low HP, or so it would seem. Klefki's stats aren't amazing, but they are just good enough in conjunction with its amazing type, superb utility move pool, and Prankster ability for Klefki to do what it's supposed to do perfectly. And what exactly did it do? Well, Klefki's most well-known appearance was in XY and Oraz Ubers. It didn't just have a small niche though. It was one of the best, most popular, defining, and important Pokemon in the tier. A tier staple on par with or even ahead of the huge stat legendaries whose image Ubers was created in. Part of what made it so good was that it was entirely unique in the combination of traits it brought to the table. But the most important by far was its ability to reliably answer the single most terrifying Pokemon in the game, Geomancy Xerneas. It switched into all of Zern's unboosted moves quite decently and threatened the sweep ruining Thunder Wave in return. If Xerneas switched out, it would be punished with the spikes Klefki laid down, making its next switch in and setup more difficult. Turning the scariest sweeper around into spikes fodder, only Klefki could do that. Now, Klefki wasn't a hard counter to Xerneas in and of.
If you can even check Xerneas, because Xerneas is, if there's a format where Xerneas is in, or at least, you know, Xerneas is available for play, it is a thing that you consider running into, and you have to consider, well, how do I stop the Xerneas, or you know, before and or after Geomancy boost. Like, you have to have some sort of way to deal with Xerneas, whether that be Poison, Steel, Klefki, for instance, because that way you can status it and, you know, wears it down with spikes. This would be more efficient in singles. But, you know, we ran Zacian back in Sword and Shield, right? Zacian was just Behemoth Blade. I'm sweet. Come for that booty, Xerneas, right? But you had to have a way of dealing with Xerneas. So anything that can effectively deal with it, it's kind of like Kyogre, right? How if Kyogre's in a format, Kyogre and Groudon are in a format, they're just played. Expect to see Kyogre and Groudon. They are the best weather setters in the game. You know, in my opinion, and I think we can have other people substantiate this, Groudon and Kyogre, if something can, especially Kyogre, because Kyogre has a very interesting history in comparison. If something can come in and check Kyogre, especially because Kyogre sets its own rain, and especially generally runs like what specs, right? If you can come in and check a Kyogre, especially boosted, you suddenly have relevance that a lot of other things don't. So same thing here. If the fact that Klefki can come in on Xerneas not a whole lot of other Pokemon can do it in the way that it does it, it instantly gains a little more relevance.
Of itself in the event Xerneas decided to stay in and slug it out, but it didn't need to be. Should Xerneas attempt that, it'd still find itself paralyzed and therefore vulnerable to a huge portion of the tier, especially since after the paralysis, Klefki had the option of chipping it down further with the Play Rough that was boosted by Xerneas' own Fairy Aura, the same Play Rough that prevented Substitute Xerneas from avoiding that all-important Thunder Wave. Alternatively, if the follow-up answer to Xerneas didn't need the extra chip, Klefki could throw down some spikes. Even Rest Talk Xerneas wouldn't get the job done. That's what Klefki's heal block was for. As if answering Xerneas and laying spikes wasn't enough, Klefki leveraged its resistance-laden typing and Prankster Thunder Wave to switch in on and threaten several more of the scariest Pokemon around. Darkrai, Yveltal, Mewtwo, and the Laddie twins, with the Laddies being especially relevant since they were the most common defoggers around, and Klefki spiked in their faces with ease. Klefki's Prankster Thunder Wave could threaten anything, from Mega Gengar to Mega Salamence, and its spikes supported its teammates beautifully, making them even more threatening. This was far and away Klefki's greatest niche, but it had others. It popped up near the end of XYOU to counter Mega Gardevoir, which was shredding the tier with ease, and to lay the spikes which were gaining traction. It also occasionally appeared in Auras, with Magnet Rise and Foul Play turning the tables on a seemingly perfect answer, Excadrill. Finally, even though Gen 7's Prankster nerf meant Klefki could no longer Thunder Wave Dark types like Yveltal, and T-Wave itself also got nerfed to 90% accuracy.
I remember Gen 7 did a lot of these nerfs as well, and I wasn't super happy about a lot of that. Gen 7 also saw Gengar lose Levitate, which Haunter Eviolite has kind of taken over that role in a sense. Gen 7 did balance a lot of things in a way that I kind of didn't really agree with. If I remember correctly as well, didn't Steel... Well, no, I think this is going into Gen 8 maybe, right? Steel lost its resistance to Dark, right? If I remember correctly. Or something along those lines. Like, there was a lot that happened in recent modernity in terms of Pokemon.
And having the opponent's speed as opposed to its previous 100% and quartering respectively. And there was also an incredible new Steel Fairy type Magearna. Klefki still managed a decent niche in Gen 7 Ubers. Its presence in Gen 6 Ubers though was one of a kind, perfectly illustrating that even in the strongest metagame out there, stats aren't everything.
Xatu, really?
Xatu may share typing with Lugia, but that's about it. It's outright
Psychic Flying with Magic Bounce. So, I mean, its speed tier is, what, arguably the same as Rayquaza's, right? 95. So it's already really fast. HP, I mean, it's very frail. I mean, it's got decent bulk is what I will say. I mean, if the attack was like 60 and the extra 15 points went into something else, like maybe Special Defense or something like that, you know, awesome. But, like, it's not overly bulky, but it's serviceable, right? Especially with the 95 speed, I mean, you're firing off things pretty quick in comparison to a lot of other things, at least towards the, like, mid-high end, right? Notable Roost, Reflect, U-Turn, Nightshade, Heat Wave. I mean, these are all really good moves, because Nightshade just deals damage based on its level. So, right, Xatu being level 100, it'll do 100 damage to Ferrothorn. It's just a consistent Seismic Toss, and Nightshade will just do a consistent damage equal to the user's level, which is awesome for if things are thresholded in a certain way, so you're not worried about maybe like a roll or something like that, high roll, low roll. Can help with that. Reflect, just generally good to, you know, if you can get it set up, helps your party. Roost for self-heal. U-Turn to help keep that momentum going. You do lose the bonuses. So, for example, say you Swords Danced, right? Not that Xatu can learn it. But if you Swords Dance and you U-Turn, you don't keep the Swords Dance buff. That's Baton Pass specifically. But U-Turn keeps up the momentum. And then Heat Wave, because hitting Ferrothorn, I hear, is tech, and also that 30% chance to burn is tech. Magic Bounce as well, being an excellent ability, especially for a lead, because if they say, for example, Ferrothorn tries to set spikes, anything tries to set rocks, anything tries to set, I think even Sticky Web too, right? It will just bounce back at the target, and thus, you know, they have wasted a turn and have lost momentum. They have gained negative momentum, while you have kind of maintained stable and are gaining on momentum yourself.
Poor bulk is exacerbated by nasty weaknesses to Stealth Rock and Pursuit, while its offenses aren't exactly noteworthy even in the lower tiers, and its move pool isn't anything to write home about either. However, true to the Quagsire Theorem, Xatu has just the right attributes in just the right places, which it can use to carve out the slightest niche for itself. Its standout trait is, of course, its Magic Bounce ability. Bouncing back all manner of utility is useful, from status to Leech Seed to Taunt to phasing, but its primary function is the blocking of entry hazards, one of the most important components of competitive singles. Being able to deny hazards opens so many possibilities and opportunities in both team building and the battle itself, and nowhere is this on clearer display than Xatu's most prominent appearance, Gen 5 OU, where it becomes a Sun team staple. Without hazards, its teammate Dugtrio was free to run Focus Sash, while Volcarona was one of the most ludicrously threatening Pokemon around when unimpeded by rocks. Xatu had no problem completely shutting down the tier Spikers, Ferrothorn, and Skarmory. This was absolutely excellent given how much of Gen 5 OU revolved around spikes. Xatu especially enjoyed facing Pharaoh on raid teams, since it'd almost always be the team's stealth rocker as well. However, Xatu had a problem. Other stealth rockers were far more difficult for it to deal with. After all, it was weak to Tyranitar, totally blanked by Heatran, and none too enthused about facing Landorus Therian either. Those were just the bulky rockers too. Something more offensive like Garchomp or Terrakion? Forget it. Xatu didn't need to beat all of these on its own though. What made it so good was the way its traits worked in conjunction with its teammates. Its weaknesses could even be turned into advantages. This was most apparent in the Tyranitar matchup. Sure, Tyranitar dominated Xatu one-on-one in a nutshell, but with Rocky Helmet, Xatu completely flipped the script. Each time Tyranitar crunched Xatu, it would take significant chip damage. Xatu was just bulky enough to where it could force several crunches with Roost too, and if it managed to get a Reflect Up, it could even win. Xatu didn't need to beat Tyranitar itself though, just chip it low enough for its teammate Dugtrio to pick off afterwards, ensuring the Weather War was won for the Sun team. It was similarly effective against Heatran. If Heatran ever wanted to actually KO Xatu, it'd be punished with the Dugtrio trap afterwards. Xatu's deceptive bulk meant it was surprisingly adept at taking on Landorus Therian too. Not ironclad, but good enough to allow for leeway in playing against it. And with Rocky Helmet and Nightshade, it could even mess with Garchomp enough for Dugtrio to finish the job. To give an idea of how bulky max defense Xatu was, it was overwhelmingly favored to survive a Terrakion Stone Edge from full health. As a nice side bonus, Xatu also completely countered the massively irritating Breloom. Xatu's hazard blocking was so infuriatingly reliable that it was a major contributing factor to why Sun teams wound up being broken. If you could beat them with hazards, it's hard to imagine them getting nerfed via bans the way they were repeatedly. Talk about bypassing your low stats effectively. Other than that niche, Gen 5 Uber's teams generally preferred Espeon as a magic bouncer. Far higher speed and offensive capability, but Xatu's access to U-turn, one of the best moves in the game, also gave it a niche in that tier, which was famously hazard heavy. Furthermore, hyper offense teams so Oraz OU briefly enjoyed Xatu for both its fast-paced hazard blocking and the dual screens it would set, enabling threats like Mega Charizard X with particularly terrifying efficiency. However, Gen 5 OU was where Xatu really shone as a consistently legit part of the metagame.
Gen 5 is relevant because effectively the OU from the prior generation, for the most part, everything shifted down a tier, right? So if you were an OU in if you were an OU in Gen 4 Sinnoh, Diamond Pearl, DPP, there we go. I, for some reason, was like GSC. I'm like, that's not what that is, Kip. DPP. So you would be now UU. You'd be underused. UU went down to, I think it was RU at that point. There were less tiers at that point in time, if I remember correctly. But everything shifted down. So Xatu being able to be used in OU Gen 5 is not a small feat.
Wrangling as much value as possible out of its low stats any way it could, including sacrificing itself.
The king himself.
Nidoking is the only Pokemon on this list with a single base stat over 100, which ordinarily would disqualify it from contention, but we're making an exception because in the generation specified, it doesn't even use that base 102 attack stat. Okay, so it could slot in Focus Punch in Gen 8 for Blissey, but in practice it usually didn't, on account of wanting several other generally more useful moves. Even if it wanted to mess with Blissey, it generally preferred Taunt, which was a more valuable move overall. So for all intents and purposes, Nidoking was a pure special attacker, and that was just Gen 8. Anyway, in 7 and 6, it never even thought of the move since it just bounced off the Eviolite Chansey that was the preferred special walling blob. So we feel justified in Nidoking's inclusion here. What would be a thoroughly underwhelming base 85 special attack stat by OU standards skyrockets into one of the scariest threats around when bolstered by Nidoking's many other excellent attributes. First, its move pool is overflowing with outstanding choices. It is perfectly poised to crush most walls with its stabs and Ice Beam. Beam. Sludge.
So Nidoking kind of falls into the Gen 1 effect, as I call it, because in Gen 1 there wasn't a whole hell of a lot of moves. There really wasn't. That's why you'll see something like Meowth and Persian getting like Thunderbolt. You'll see Tauros getting like Blizzard Ray. You'll see random things getting like Fire Blast and Ice Beam and stuff like that. Because in Gen 1, there really wasn't a whole lot of moves. And that's not to knock on Gen 1 at all. It's just explaining, right? You know, so Nidoking getting Flamethrower and Ice Beam. Sludge Wave makes sense. Earth Power makes sense because it is. You can see Poison Ground. So that does make sense. Substitute, Gen 1, a lot of things use Substitute. Gen 2, a lot of things use Substitute as well. That's why you'll have these odd inclusions at times, like if you look at certain move pools from Gen 1 and even Gen 2 as well. Sheer Force is one of my favorite abilities in the game. Top probably 10-ish, I would say. Sheer Force makes it so that any move that would have a potential bonus effect, so Ice Beam, 10% chance to freeze, right? That will go down to 0% chance to freeze, but the damage gets increased by 30%. Unless it's somehow changed within the past couple generations, but it was 30% last I checked. So it go hit hard. And the fact that Nidoking just uses the special attack stat, the moves are good. It has just the right amount of special attack, 85, 90. If it was down to like 80, 75, probably wouldn't do as well. But the fact that Earth Power has like base 90, I think it is. Sludge Wave, I think, is 90 as well. Ice Beam's base 90. Flamethrower is base 90. It used to be base 95 in Gen 3 from my understanding. That's a whole different thing altogether. It's awesome is what it is. This fits just the right amount of things with everything as going on. Like electric immunity. Being a poison type that it can counter certain things like fairy types. With the sheer force, with the stat blocks that it has, even ignoring its attack stat. It's got a lot going for it.
Wave shreds bulky fairies and grasses, while Earth Power tears through steels and Toxapex, and Ice Beam ensures it has zero problems with any ground flying types, walling the two moves. It can bolster this coverage further with Thunderbolt to really lay into waters, or Flamethrower to effortlessly smash the likes of Ferrothor. Both moves ensure it crushes steel flying types too. Its coverage is so good with just stabs and Ice Beam though, that it doesn't even need that last attack. It can delve into utilities such as with the aforementioned Taunt or Toxic Spikes, letting it support itself and or its team against annoying Pokemon like Chansey, or most commonly Substitute, which ruins any attempt to play around Nidoking with Prediction. With Substitute, you can't pivot in a faster Pokemon on a move it resists to threaten it out anymore. The safety of the sub means it's always going to blast whatever it's facing with the strongest move possible, which usually means a KO. But wait, what of that base 85 special attack? Super effective coverage is great, but you've got to have more than that. Well, that's where Nidoking's amazing sheer force ability comes in, removing the secondary effects of moves that have them, but giving them a massive boost in power. That's not all either, as Nidoking gets even stronger with Life Orb, which it runs without drawback, as any move boosted by sheer force will not take Life Orb recoil. Thus, Nidoking has amazing raw strength, ensuring even...
I feel like that's a bug. Did they fix that? I can't remember if they fixed that or not. That sounds like a bug in coding, because at that point it's Life Orb for free. And something else can come along with Sheer Force that has more dominant effects, dominant stats than Nidoking, be a little more oppressive, and could use that and abuse that. I'd be very curious to see if that gets patched out.
Neutral targets get hit incredibly hard. Forget taking its Sludge Waves up.
Patched out, I mean in the future reworked.
All decently
like
with Rotom Wash, for example. But with the huge number of Pokemon it hits super effectively, it becomes a one-hit KO machine. What makes Nidoking especially threatening is that it has terrific defensive typing for an offensive Pokemon. It's resistant to Stealth Rock, immune to Thunder Wave and Toxic, and even absorbs Toxic Spikes upon switching in, which is massively helpful team support. It can't be worn down by Sandstorm, and it can take some actual attacking moves as well, most notably boasting an immunity to Volt Switch and a resist to Moonblast. And so Nidoking has been one of the most feared wall breakers in OU for the last several generations it's been in.
Yeah.
Clefable often vexes players because they don't understand why it takes so little damage from everything. Base 90.
So important to note up on the top left how it says special attack 95, 85 pre-Gen 6. Clefable is one of, as well as on the side here, pre-XY normal, post-XY fairy. Clefable is one of the very few Pokemon that Pokemon has outright just buffed in a certain aspect. Prior to Gen 6, it was at 85 special attack. After Gen 6, X and Y, is when it did have went up to 95 special attack. Pokemon does this very rarely. Masquerain is another example of just a straight, here, we're going to give you more stat. We're going to give you more numerical advantage to your stats, right? They just give it more. Also, this was a Pokemon that, and I for the longest time was thinking, is Fairy just going to replace Normal? I'm glad that it didn't, because Normal type still has a lot of utility, but it was Normal prior to Gen 6, and then it became pure Fairy type. So I thought for a time that they were, this was early Gen 6, we're talking early X and Y, that I'm like, are they just phasing out Normal types? Are they just making this the new norm? And maybe they could have, maybe from a design standpoint, maybe they were attempting to, but Normal types still are, they've gotten really good. There are some really good Normal types out there, and even then they're combining, like Oranguru, right, combines Normal and Psychic, meaning that Ghost doesn't affect it. Like, there's Normal's doing things now. And I like that they've rebalanced a lot of the typings. Like, Bug used to be pretty much useless. We've gone over that with Miko on stream with our Bug Pokemon tier list, right? But as time went on, it became a relevant typing. And, this is, not just the little buggos that you find in Evolved to learn the Evolve mechanic. This is, an outright typing with advantages and disadvantages that can play with the big boys, right? Where you have things like, U-Turn is still Bug type, right? Just things like that. So Clefable is interestingly one of the only and one of the few Pokemon that has received an outright, almost rework, if you will. It gets Magic Guard and Unaware. Both are very good abilities. Quagsire himself uses Unaware. Your opponent can go +6 Garchomp, but you're just not going to carry and drop a Moonblast while that Garchamp's buffing up, because there's no reason to boost up, right? As well as a move pool of Soft Boil for self-heal, Stealth Rock if you lead with it, you get Rock Support off, chipping things into one-shot range, thresholding them, if you will. Calm Mind for getting bulk. Knockoff, especially buff knockoff, is cracked. T-Wave, always good. Gen 7 went down to 90% accuracy, but even still it is an option. With Moonblast, Ice Beam, Flamethrower, Thunderbolt, good damaging abilities, great damaging abilities. Encore and Wish, Wish for more self-sustain. You probably won't see Wish Softball on the same set. Encore, very, very, very utility focused.
95 HP is good, but 90 special defense doesn't seem like it make it as bulky as it is. And that applies even more so to its 73 defense. How is it that a Pokemon with this defensive profile is so unkillable? Of course, the first answer is Magic Guard. It's easy to remain in pristine hit-taking condition when you don't have to worry about entry hazard or status damage. The second answer is Soft Boiled, making it even easier for Clefable to stay healthy. However, Clefable also does have to take actual hits, and that it does with Aplomb, demonstrating that those seemingly low stats actually have quite some heft to them. It helps that Clefable is far from passive. If it was an unthreatening blob a la something like Cresselia, it wouldn't matter that you can't immediately overwhelm it with damage. You just keep hitting it. However, Clefable's excellent move pool makes it quite threatening in its own right, which means you've got to hit it hard and do it quickly, and therein lies the issue. In most cases, Clefable's bulk gets the job done within the window you have to overwhelm it without being ruined in return. Even many super effective hits like Bisharp and Excadrill Ironhead aren't threatening it for a one-hit KO, and Clefable can do some nasty stuff if you give it that opportunity to, which is quite difficult to avoid. The example of its bulk goes as far back as Gen 4, before it had the resistances of the Fairy typing to bolster its defensive profile further.
So Gen 4 was also notably the physical special split, because prior to Gen 4, so Gen 1, 2, 3, right, RBY, GSC, RSE, right, and even Fire Red, Leaf Green, right, the typings had a physical or special designation. So, for example, the reason Flareon wasn't used, despite having a 130 attack stat, is that fire typing, all fire moves were special, and you couldn't use that. That's why Flareon nowadays, like Flare Blitz, right? Something like that. Cool, it's gonna go places. Back then, you have Flareon with Flamethrower, but sure, you can maybe have like a Body Slam or something, right? I can't remember if it's Body Slam offhand. But like something like a Body Slam would use the 130 because Normal would be a physical typing, like Ground would be a physical typing, but things like Psychic, things like Fire would be even Water would be a special type. So all moves of that type will be designated as physical or special. Gen 4 was different because it was the inception of Pokemon having the physical special split, where we can have something like Surf, but we can also have something like Liquidation, right? If that makes sense. This is noteworthy.
Or that it was a normal type and had just about nothing in the way of useful resistances. It was neutral to everything and still devoured hits with ease. It then did the same things it did as a fairy type. It set up rocks, it spread Thunderwave and knockoff, it could threaten with Calm Mind and or its special coverage moves, and maybe even recoil-less Life Orb. It had all manner of superb utility in Wish and Encore and Heal Bell. In Gen 8, it became renowned for how easily it passed Wish to its teammates through Teleport. Of course, one can't speak too highly about Magic Guard, which gave Clefable terrific utility and outlasting slower paced opponents while keeping it healthy enough to withstand hits from faster ones. This was the backbone of its viability as a staple in Gens 4, 6, 7, and 8 OU. Magic Guard was so good, it even gave normal type Clefable niches in the higher powered metagames of Gen 5 OU and Gen 4 Ubers. However, Clefable did occasionally use its other ability unaware in OU and Ubers in both Gen 6 and 8. It wasn't quite the same as his Magic Guard dominance, but it was still useful in its own right, especially with how scary Xerneas was. But as far as unaware Pokemon go, there was another. But before we get to it, we have to quickly rattle off some honorary mentions. First, despite its seemingly unimpressive stats, Nidoqueen's outstanding defensive profile gave it an incredibly important place in Gen 4 OU. With its amazing Toxic Spikes absorption and fighting resistance, it, alongside the fellow seemingly low stats lower tier Pokemon Clefable, which it's so commonly partnered up with, completely changed the face of defense in the tier and forced offense to adapt in a major way. Second, several Pokemon with poor or unimpressive stat spreads have been launched to huge viability or even brokenness in OU by virtue of their abilities. Dugtrio and Gothitelle have brutal trapping capabilities, and Ninetales, Polytone, and Pelipper set weather. Finally, Gastrodon has had a long time history in lower tiers, only to repeatedly show up and dominate OU, sometimes even making appearances in Ubers. Gastro's viability is often attached purely to Storm Drain's buff in Gen 5, which has made it as good as it has been for so long, but it also was an effective choice with the trick and knockoff blocking effect of Sticky Hold in Gen 4 OU. However, Gastrodon's base HP is way too high to consider it a true exemplar of this theorem, as opposed to
him, the boy.
This theorem's namesake is now synonymous with the unaware ability, especially given its fittingly content, vacant expression. But Quagsire was doing great things as far back as Generation 4 with its water absorb ability. Upon receiving recovery in Heart Gold and Soul Silver, it could finally make the most of its outstanding, unique defensive typing. It was an amazing water type answer that shrugged off the obligatory ice coverage with ease, giving it an excellent niche in OU, shrugging off Starmie, Suicune, and Gyarados alike. It was also a great answer to several other threats like Zapdos, Heatran, Tyranitar, and many variants of Jirachi. Water Absorb Quagsire wasn't just good in OU either. It worked beautifully in Ubers, where it blanked none other than King Kyogre, immune to its Water Stab, immune to Thunder, and just specially bulky enough to shrug off even Ice Beams. What if Kyogre started Calm Minding? Well, then Quagsire would encore it, and that be that. Gen 5 buffing Storm Drain to include a water immunity meant Water Absorb Quagsire was now outclassed by Gastrodon in OU and Ubers alike. But that was just fine, as Gen 5 had also bestowed upon Quag its now signature ability, Unaware. It switched over to physical defense and effortlessly sat on the high-powered physical attackers running through the rest of OU. Even the terrifying likes of Swords Dance Excadrill and Dragon Dance Dragonite wouldn't get past Quag, who ignored their boosts and devoured their attacks with ease. It could even help against the likes of the famed Stall Killer, Calm Mind Reuniclus. In staving off such monstrous boosting sweepers, Quagsire gave life to stall teams which struggled to withstand the enormous power Gen 5 had brought with it, boosting their viability to the point where whether it was sand or rain stall, defense anchored by Quagsire was among the most reliable team styles in the game. Quagsire pulled this same trick in Gen 6 OU. Pokemon like Bisharp and Mega Charizard X would ordinarily threaten nearly any defensive squad, but with Quagsire around, they were basically non-factors. Quagsire was a fixture on dedicated stall teams throughout the generation for this reason. Quagsire was so good at doing this job that some players even bemoaned its efficiency, claiming that it could be unreasonably difficult to break through stall when boosting wasn't an option. In X and Y Ubers, Quagsire also had a niche. It walled none other than Extreme Killer Arceus.
I would argue, have you considered hitting Quagsire with a grass move? Have you considered, especially in Gen 7, right? Have you considered our Lord and Savior Kartana, who was everywhere? I mean, I haven't played enough of those formats. I do think that it's like Quagsire is an option, but it's not like Quagsire is like Uber's tier like Kyogre, right? I mean, Quagsire, I feel, it rewards skilled play. You know, I could show up with a Quagsire and I'll probably lose the match, let's be real. but someone who knows what they're doing, someone who knows the ins and outs of the games better than I do, someone who's arguably a more skilled player than I am, could use Quagsire to greater effect. I feel it has a higher skill ceiling with a higher barrier to entry, right?
Turns out being the god of Pokemon has no effect on those who are ignorant. Quagsire wasn't as much of a stall staple in Gen 7 OU, but it still had its place. But this was nothing compared to Gen 8 Ubers. Zacian Crown tore through everything in sight with absurd speed and attack, with the latter receiving a +1 boost whenever it switched in. Who do you call when there's a boosting threat? None other than Quagsire, of course. It ignored the boost and just barely avoided a 2-hit KO, making it one of the most reliable checks to one of the most impossible to stop Pokemon in history.
I really fucking and then Clodsire came out and man, Quagsire would be like, man, he's kind of tickling me. Clodsire, hold my beer. Starts firing off earthquakes.
Again, this is the real reason Quagsire is #1 on this list and has the theorem named after it. In 3 different generations, it has stifled the most dangerous Pokemon in the game. And that's it. Of course, stats are important. Even though Quagsire and Clefable aren't Giratina tier bulky, they still are great hit takers. However, it's always great to see that you don't need to have obscenely high stats in order to succeed, or even to have multiple very good stats. This list is comprised of Pokemon who don't break even base 100 in a single stat, with the exception of Nidoking and the attack stat it doesn't use. It's just a matter of the right traits coming together. Thanks for watching, everyone, and as always, if you liked the video and you want to see more, be sure to subscribe to False Swipe Gaming for more weekly Pokemon content, and in the comments, I want to know, what do you think about this theorem? Were there any Pokemon you thought should have been on this list? Whatever it is, let me know in the comments, and thank you so much to our patrons for continued support of our videos, and thank you to everyone else watching as well.
No, it was a solid video. I loved it. Solid video, Quagsire. The one thing I will bemoan about Quagsire is it has not gotten back Belly Drum since a Gen 2 event, which couldn't even go to Gen 3 because of how Gen 2, Gen 3 worked in terms of hardware.
And follow my crew on these social media platforms. And that's all I got. See you next time, everyone.
It was an event given out to GSC cards, and it was I think it was a Wooper specifically, but with Belly. Quagsire once upon a time got Belly Drum, but there's no copy that can go towards modern day because it's before Gen 3 that can actually get legally Belly Drum, and it makes me sad. I would love a Belly Drum Quagsire. No, it was a great video. I loved it, and this can be applied to other games as well. This is just specifically Pokemon and examples within Pokemon, but you know, this can be applied to other games. It absolutely can. I really enjoyed this FFG. Thank you for posting this. This was awesome to look over. This was awesome to react to as well. Keep up the good work. Sending what support I can your way.